Just hours after the devastating loss of Rob Reiner, one voice in Hollywood chose not to remain quiet. Billy Crystal, shaken and overwhelmed by grief, reached out and shared something that sent a chill through the industry. He insisted this was not random. This was not an unforeseeable tragedy. According to Crystal, Rob Reiner had lived with fear for years. Fear rooted not in strangers, but within his own family. What Billy disclosed next stunned even those closest to the situation. He spoke of quiet changes made remember, of attempts to safeguard those he loved, and of an unease Rob had carried silently for a long time. This was not a story crafted for headlines. It was a truth Billy Crystal believed could no longer remain hidden. No matter how uncomfortable it might be, Billy Crystal did not step forward for attention. He spoke because remaining silent felt like a betrayal. For nearly 5 decades, Rob Reiner was more than a colleague to him. He was family. They first crossed paths in the early 1970s on All in the Family. But what began as professional collaboration grew into a bond that endured failures, successes, divorces, and the relentless pressure of Hollywood. Billy once described Rob as the brother he chose, and he meant it. That bond was evident the night everything fell apart. Standing outside the Brentwood home, Billy looked less like a public figure and more like a man whose world had just fractured. As the shock settled in, one thought refused to let go. Rob had feared this outcome long before it became reality. The night of December 14th, 2025 began quietly for Billy Crystal. He was at home with his wife, Janice, easing into the evening when the phone rang. Then it rang again. When he finally answered, the voice on the other end was unsteady, barely recognizable. Something terrible has happened to Rob and Michelle. At first, the words did not make sense. Billy asked the question everyone asks when the impossible collides with reality. The response came in broken pieces. Brentwood. Police. Murder. The phone slipped from his hand. Janice stood frozen beside him as the meaning sank in. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. They drove to Brentwood without a word. The street was blocked off with yellow tape, red and blue lights washing over homes that had no idea what had just been lost. A line had been crossed. When Billy stepped from the car, witnesses later said he looked as though decades had passed in moments. His shoulders sagged, his hands shook, and silent tears traced his face as he stared at the house where laughter once lived. He did not stop for reporters or answer a single question. Instead, Billy Crystal approached the fence quietly, placed a small bundle of white flowers against it, and stood there unmoving, as if walking away would make the loss final. Janice held his hand firmly, anchoring him as he struggled to breathe under the crushing weight, settling in his chest. But sorrow was not the only emotion taking hold. As early details surfaced multiple stab wounds, no evidence of forced entry shock began to mutate into something far more unsettling. Confusion gave way to dread, and dread sharpened into anger. Within hours, Billy made a decision that sent shockwaves through Hollywood. He contacted Rolling Stone. His voice trembled, but his words were chosen with care. This was not random, he said. Rob had not feared strangers or intruders. He had feared someone close, someone he loved. Billy revealed that Rob had confided in him about unresolved legal concerns, about quietly revising his will again and again in an effort to protect certain members of his family. He trusted me, Billy said. He was afraid, and now everything he feared has happened. When pressed further, Billy did not retreat. Grief had hardened into resolve. He spoke of a child Rob had spent years trying to help, a child he loved without condition. A child whose struggles had weighed on him long before that final night. I know who could be responsible, Billy said, his voice breaking but unwavering, and I won't let this be buried in silence. Those words ignited an immediate firestorm. Within hours, the interview spread, reopening questions that had lingered in whispers for years. Billy Crystal was not simply mourning a friend. He was breaking a silence Rob Reiner himself had been too afraid to break while alive. As Hollywood grappled with the weight of those claims, one truth became impossible to ignore. This tragedy did not begin in Brentwood that night. It had been forming for years, concealed beneath love, fear, and a silence that was finally giving way. Billy's words did not feel impulsive. They felt unavoidable. Rob had lived with a quiet fear he rarely voiced publicly. He loved his children deeply, but one relationship burdened him more than the rest. A son he had tried repeatedly to protect, to save. Addiction had entered that bond long before it ever reached the headlines. Trust didn't collapse all at once. It wore away slowly, relentlessly, like water carving grooves into stone. Rob never abandoned his faith in love as the answer. He believed patience could mend what was broken. He believed support mattered more than punishment. While others might have shut doors, he opened his home. He paid for treatment. He endured relapse after relapse, each one scraping away at hope without ever fully destroying it. For Rob, surrender was never an option. That conviction led to being Charlie. It was never meant to entertain. It was a lifeline, a very public expression of love disguised as cinema. Rob believed that if his son could truly see himself reflected on screen, something might finally shift. Something might finally reach him. But movies end. Addiction does not. Privately, Rob began preparing for realities no parent ever wants to face. He made quiet legal changes, revising his will, trying to protect some children from harm caused by others. He confided only in those he trusted without reservation. Billy Crystal was one of them. Rob wasn't irrational. He was worn down. He understood the difference between hope and denial, and he knew how dangerously thin the line between them had become. Still, he never stopped loving. He never stopped waiting. He never stopped believing, even as fear crept into places once filled with certainty. What outsiders never saw was how long this tragedy had been unfolding. How many chances had already been extended? How many warning signs had gone unanswered? As the investigation progressed, one question refused to disappear. At what point does unconditional love become the very thing that allows catastrophe to take root? Billy Crystal's words rippled through Hollywood with a weight heavier than celebrity mourning. This was no longer just about loss. It became a reckoning with responsibility, silence, and the collision between private fear and public devastation. Billy did not speak as an accuser. He didn't claim absolute truth. He spoke from closeness, from decades of conversations far removed from cameras, built on trust earned over a lifetime. He made one thing clear. Rob Reiner was not blind. Rob had noticed the signs. He had voiced his worries. He had taken steps that suggested preparation, not surprise. Those details forced an uncomfortable realization. Rob Reiner believed deeply in redemption. His films were shaped by faith in growth, healing, and return from darkness. In his own life, that belief remained right up until the moment it could no longer protect the people he loved. He carried that belief to the very end. Rob was convinced that pulling love away would only push someone further into the dark, so he stayed. He kept access open. He waited longer than most ever could. But hope extracts a price. As investigators continued piecing events together, Billy Crystal's grief sharpened into resolve. A determination that Rob's life not be swallowed by confusion or quietly, reduced to a headline without meaning. Billy spoke not to provoke outrage, but to prevent erasure. He wanted to make sure the final chapter of his friend's life wasn't stripped of context. This didn't come out of nowhere, he said. Rob was afraid, and he had reasons. Those words landed with weight because they challenged the comforting myth that tragedy is always sudden, random, and unknowable. Instead, Billy pointed towards something far more unsettling, a slow unraveling marked by emotional erosion, unresolved struggle, and a family stretched thin behind closed doors. The public response was immediate and divided. Some praised Billy's honesty, calling it an act of loyalty. Others questioned whether such truths should be shared at all, especially so soon after loss. What no one denied was the depth of the bond behind his words. For nearly 5 decades, Billy Crystal and Rob Reiner had stood side by side through success, disappointment, marriages, and reinvention. Billy had seen Rob at his strongest and at his most exposed. When he spoke, it wasn't as a commentator. It was as a witness. As tributes flooded in from fans and filmmakers, one theme kept resurfacing. Rob Reiner gave fully to the people he loved, perhaps too fully, perhaps for too long, but never without sincerity. And as speculation grew louder, one truth remained painfully clear. This story was never only about how Rob Reiner died. It was about how he lived. How he loved. And how silence, once meant to protect, may have allowed something tragic to grow unnoticed until it was too late. What remains are not neat answers, but difficult questions about family, about restraint, and about how far devotion can go before it loses its power. Reiner built a career on stories of redemption, understanding, and second chances. In his own life, he lived those beliefs to the very end, perhaps longer than anyone should have to. Billy Crystal didn't speak to create scandal. He spoke because memory matters, and because truth, even when painful, deserves to be faced. What happened in that Brentwood home didn't begin in a single night. It unfolded quietly over years, in the fragile space where hope and fear lived side by side. If this story made you pause or reflect, share your thoughts in the comments. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and stay with us as we continue telling the stories history leaves unfinished.